My wife's sister slapped me in front of my kids and screamed I wasn't a real father. She had no idea I'd been saving every text, proving exactly who she really was. My cheek was on fire. I smiled anyway. Since you brought it up, I said, let's talk about that. 90 seconds earlier, the backyard had looked perfect. Paper lanterns strung between the maple tree and the porch rail. Grilled chicken smoking on the grill. Patrick never quite knew how to light himself. Margaret's 70th birthday. 20-some relatives balancing paper plates on their knees. My son Owen chasing my daughter Lily around a lawn I'd mowed that morning before anyone else was awake. I'd spent most of the day on my knees fixing the bottom deck step, the one Margaret had been complaining about since spring, and keeping the twins from Patrick's side of the family away from the cupcake table before dinner. Same as every family gathering for the last 6 years. Nobody asks who fixes the step. They just stop noticing it's broken. Vanessa had been drinking wine since 2 in the afternoon and watching me the way she always did, like she was waiting for me to slip. She never liked me. From the first Thanksgiving, I showed up at Margaret's table. She called me Saint Daniel under her breath, usually right after I'd done something as ordinary as cutting Owen's chicken into smaller pieces or double-checking Lily's seatbelt. I adopted my wife Claire's kids from her first marriage 4 years ago, and in Vanessa's mouth, adopted always sounded like a technicality, a loophole, something that could be revoked if I ever gave her a reason. I let it slide for 4 years. I told myself that's what you do for family. You let the small cuts heal on their own instead of picking at them in front of everyone. Then Owen reached across the table for a cookie and bumped Vanessa's elbow. Her wine went down the front of her cream blouse in one long red streak. Owen, apologize, I said, already reaching for a napkin. I'm sorry, Aunt Vanessa, he whispered, 6 years old and already flinching before she'd said a word. Her face twisted into something I'd seen building for years, but never quite this close. Of course he's sorry. No real discipline. That's what happens when kids are raised by someone who's just pretending. Not in front of the kids, I said quietly, and I meant it as a boundary, not a challenge. She stood up so fast her chair scraped against the patio stone. Your kids? Her hand cracked across my face before I even finished registering the question as rhetorical. Lily screamed. Owen froze mid-step, one sneaker still half untied from the afternoon of running. The whole yard went dead silent, 20-some relatives holding their forks in midair, waiting to see whether I'd yell or grab her wrist or walk away. You're not even a real father, Vanessa yelled, loud enough that I heard Patrick's mother gasp 2 tables over. You just adopted them. I touched my cheek. It was hot under my palm, already starting to swell along the cheekbone. I smiled anyway because somewhere underneath the sting, something in me had been waiting 4 years for exactly this opening, and I wasn't going to waste it by losing my temper. Since you brought it up, I said, maybe it's time everyone heard the truth. To understand why that sentence landed the way it did, you have to understand what came before it. Not just the 4 years I'd spent as Lily and Owen's father, but the 2 years before that, when their biological father, Mark Reyes, decided fatherhood was optional and left a 26-year-old single mother to raise a toddler and a newborn on a part-time teacher's salary in a 1-bedroom apartment outside Portland. I met Claire when Lily was 4 and Owen was 2. I was 31, working as a project manager for a general contracting firm, the kind of guy who fixes things because sitting still with a problem has always made me more uncomfortable than the problem itself. Claire was exhausted in the specific way only single parents are exhausted. Not tired from one bad night, but tired in her bones from 2 straight years of nobody sharing the load. We met at a hardware store on a Saturday morning, of all places, both of us standing in the same aisle staring at deadbolts. She was trying to figure out which one she could install herself with a 2-year-old strapped to her chest and a 4-year-old pulling paint chips off the end cap display. I ended up in her driveway that same afternoon, installing it for her, mostly because watching her try to hold a drill steady with Owen asleep against her collarbone was more than I could stand to just walk away from. I didn't ask for her number that day. I asked if I could come back Tuesday and fix the storm door that wouldn't latch. She said yes. That's the whole story of how I fell in love with all 3 of them, really. One broken thing at a time, until there weren't any broken things left that I wasn't already planning to fix for the rest of my life. Mark had been gone since Owen was 14 months old. No calls, no birthday cards, no child support, not because a court hadn't ordered it, but because he'd simply vanished. No forwarding address, no employer anyone could garnish, nothing. Claire's family, especially Vanessa, treated his disappearance the way you'd treat weather. Bad luck. Something that happened to Claire. Not something anyone was allowed to be angry about out loud, because Mark was still technically family. The early red flags with Vanessa were small enough that I told myself I was imagining them. At my and Claire's wedding, Vanessa gave a toast that mentioned everyone at the head table except me twice, and somehow found a way to bring up Mark's kids instead of Claire's kids, as if I were a temporary arrangement rather than the man who'd been reading them bedtime stories for 2 years. I told myself it was an accident, a slip born of too much champagne. I didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. 2 years into the marriage, when Claire and I filed the paperwork to begin the step-parent adoption process, Vanessa asked me at a Sunday dinner, in front of the kids, why I'd want to take on someone else's mess, when I could just have my own eventually. I felt my stomach drop the way it does right before you say something you'll regret, and instead, I excused myself to the kitchen and ran the water until the feeling passed. I didn't confront her. I told myself the adoption was almost final, and none of it would matter once the paperwork was signed. It mattered more than I expected, because 6 weeks before the adoption hearing, Mark reappeared. He called Claire on a Tuesday at 9:40 p.m., 2 years and 3 months after he'd disappeared, asking to see the kids. Claire, to her enormous credit, told him no, not until they'd talked to their family law attorney about what his sudden reappearance meant for the adoption timeline. That attorney was Rebecca Stern, 16 years practicing family and adoption law in Multnomah County, a woman with a corner office downtown, and a way of speaking that made even the worst news sound survivable. He can't simply block this by showing back up, Rebecca told us in that first meeting, sliding a legal pad across her desk. But he can delay it, and delay is its own kind of leverage. My advice, document everything from this point forward. Every call, every text, every dollar. If this turns into a dispute, and it might, you'll want a clean record. We didn't know yet how right she'd be. The complication was that Mark, once he'd made contact, went quiet again for nearly a month. Long enough that Rebecca recommended we hire a private investigator to confirm a stable address before the adoption hearing, so that any relinquishment paperwork couldn't later be challenged on grounds that he hadn't been properly notified. The investigator, a licensed PI named Frank Ibarra with a small office 2 floors below Rebecca's, tracked Mark to an extended stay motel off I-205 within 9 days, using nothing more exotic than utility records and a car registration. People think disappearing is hard, Frank told us over the phone, in the flat, unbothered tone of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. It's not. What's hard is disappearing and never once needing electricity billed to your name. His report became part of the file Rebecca kept. Proof of service, proof of address, one more piece of paper in a folder that was quietly growing thicker than any of us wanted it to. 3 weeks after that first call, Mark asked for $10,000 in exchange for signing the relinquishment papers that would let the adoption move forward without a contested hearing. Claire told me about it standing in our kitchen at 6:15 in the morning, still in her pajamas, her hands wrapped so tightly around her coffee mug, her knuckles had gone white. He wants to get paid to stop being their father, she said, and her voice cracked in a way I'd only heard once before, the week Owen was born early and spent 4 days in the NICU. I told myself it was just Mark being Mark, a man testing how much desperation was worth to the people who loved his kids more than he ever had. I didn't yet know how deep the rot went. It went deeper 2 weeks later, when Claire's credit union called about a personal loan payment that had gone 31 days past due, a loan neither of us remembered taking out. $14,000, opened 18 months earlier, during the exact stretch when Mark had vanished, and Claire still had a joint account with him that had never been fully closed. A fraud investigator at Pacific Crest Credit Union named Sandra Kim pulled the original loan application and, over a recorded line, confirmed what Claire had already started to suspect in the pit of her stomach. The signature on the application wasn't hers. It was close enough to pass a teller's glance. Not close enough to survive a forensic comparison once Sandra flagged it for review. In cases like this, Sandra told us, we typically see it when someone still has access to old statements, old signatures, sometimes even old checks. It's more common with ex-spouses than people want to believe. Claire sat very still in that meeting, hands flat on the table, and I watched something in her go cold and clear at the same time. The specific calm of someone who has just stopped being confused about a person and started being certain. The credit union gave us a 24-hour window to file a formal fraud affidavit before the next automated payment would draft from our joint checking account, a payment that, if it went through, would have made contesting the loan significantly harder, according to Sandra. I remember sitting in the parking lot afterward, engine running, watching Claire's hands shake around a printout of the fraud affidavit while she tried to sign her own name legibly for the 3rd time. What if they don't believe me? She kept saying, not really a question, more a loop her mind couldn't get out of. I told her the ink on the real signature and the ink on the fake one didn't have to convince a jury of anything. They just had to convince Sandra. And Sandra had already seen enough forged signatures in 14 years of fraud investigation to know one when the loops in the C's didn't match anything Claire had signed in a decade. The adoption hearing itself almost didn't happen on schedule. 2 days before the court date, Mark's escrow signature came back with a smudge across one corner that the county clerk flagged as potentially invalidated, and for 6 frantic hours Rebecca's office and the clerk's office went back and forth over whether we'd need to reschedule and start the notice period over from zero. I remember standing in our kitchen holding my phone, watching the clock tick toward the courthouse's 4 o'clock filing cutoff, while Rebecca's paralegal drove a corrected copy across downtown Portland in rush hour traffic. It cleared at 3:52 p.m., 8 minutes to spare. Claire didn't find out how close it had come until weeks later, because I didn't see the point in making her carry one more thing she couldn't control. I told myself, driving home that night, that surely this changed things. Surely once Vanessa understood what her sister had actually survived, the comments would stop. They didn't. If anything, they got quieter and more precise, which was somehow worse. Claire told Vanessa about the $10,000 demand a week later, mostly because she needed someone in the family to talk to who wasn't me or Rebecca. Vanessa's response, delivered over the phone while I was in the next room folding laundry, was the first crack that I actually caught in real time. Just pay him, Claire. Daniel wants to play daddy so badly. Let him prove it. Claire didn't tell me the exact words that night. She told me 2 days later, sitting on the edge of our bed, staring at her phone like it had betrayed her personally. I didn't confront Vanessa. I told myself it wasn't my place to litigate a conversation between sisters. I told myself myself Claire would handle it. I kept fixing things instead. The loose porch railing at Margaret's house, Owen's bike chain, anything with a bolt or a hinge, because those problems had solutions I could actually finish. What I didn't know, not for another 8 months, was that Vanessa had sent a second message that same week. One Claire hadn't shown anyone. Not me, not her mother, not even Rebecca at first. If Mark signs, Daniel owes you. Make sure you get something out of this marriage. Claire told me later she'd read it 4 times before she understood what her sister was actually suggesting, that my commitment to her children was a debt that needed collecting, not a choice I'd made freely over and over for years. We paid Mark the $10,000 in the end, against Rebecca's initial recommendation, because Rebecca herself eventually agreed that a clean, uncontested relinquishment was safer for the kids than a drawn-out custody fight that could drag Lily and Owen through months of depositions and evaluations. Rebecca structured the payment through an escrow arrangement so there'd be a paper trail. Exhibit C, she called it later. Once there were enough exhibits that they needed letters to keep them straight, Mark signed. The adoption finalized 11 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in a courtroom that smelled like burnt coffee, with a family court judge named Owens, no relation, we joked nervously afterward, who looked at Lily and Owen and asked them gently whether they understood what it meant to have a dad who chose them on purpose. Lily, 5 at the time, said yes. Owen, 3, just hugged my leg and wouldn't let go for the rest of the hearing. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong about that too. The kids needed help in the months that followed, not because the adoption itself was traumatic, but because Mark's reappearance had reopened wounds neither of them had words for yet. We started seeing a child psychologist named Dr. Elena Voss, PsyD, who specialized in attachment and family transition, twice a month for almost a year. She was the one who first said out loud, in a session Claire and I sat in on near the end, that Lily's nightmares about someone taking daddy away weren't about Mark at all. They were about losing me. Dr. Voss's notes, which Rebecca later kept on file in case they were ever needed, documented session after session of a little girl testing in small ways whether I would still be there in the morning. I told myself once the sessions tapered off and both kids seemed steadier, that the worst of it was behind us. I let myself believe for almost 3 years that we'd absorbed the damage and moved past it. Then came Margaret's 70th birthday, and Owen's elbow, and a glass of wine, and a hand across my face in front of 20 relatives and both of my children. Since you brought it up, I said again, standing there in that sudden silence with my cheek still burning. Let's talk about that. I turned my head slightly toward Claire, not because I needed her permission, but because 4 years of marriage means you check in with your partner before you set a table on fire, even when the table has it coming. When Claire's ex-husband abandoned these kids, I said loud enough for the whole yard to hear, he didn't just leave. He emptied part of their future college savings before he went. He forged Claire's signature on a $14,000 loan using an old joint account. Pacific Crest Credit Union confirmed it. Then, 2 years after disappearing, he came back and asked for $10,000 to sign away his rights so I could legally adopt his own children. Vanessa blinked, the wine flush drained halfway out of her face, replaced by something closer to uncertainty. And when he made that demand, I said, keeping my voice level even as my hands, down at my sides, had started to shake, you told Claire to pay him quietly. You told her Daniel wants to play daddy so badly. Let him prove it. Then you told her, if Mark signs, Daniel owes you. Make sure you get something out of this marriage. Margaret rose halfway out of her lawn chair. Vanessa? Vanessa opened her mouth. Nothing came out for a full 3 seconds, which in a silent backyard felt like an hour. You're insane, she finally said. You're making things up because I slapped you. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone, my thumb already finding the screenshots folder Rebecca had told us years earlier to keep, not for this moment specifically, but because a good attorney tells you to save everything before you ever need it. You want to talk about real fathers in front of my kids? I said. Fine. Let's talk about who actually protected them and who tried to profit off their pain. The only sound in the yard was the grill still hissing behind us. I looked at Margaret. 3 years ago, Mark came back demanding $10,000 just to sign the relinquishment papers. Claire was terrified he'd drag Lily and Owen through a contested hearing if we said no. Margaret's hand went to her mouth. Claire, why didn't you tell me any of this? I was ashamed, Claire said, her voice thinner than I'd heard it in years. It felt like something I was supposed to be able to handle quietly. It was private, Vanessa snapped, but the certainty had gone out of it. I turned the phone around so the screen faced her, then slowly panned it so Margaret and Patrick and the row of aunts and uncles behind them could see it too. Private like these? The first message was right there in blue and gray, time-stamped from 20 months earlier. Just pay him, Claire. Daniel wants to play daddy so badly, let him prove it. The second one, worse, sat just below it. If Mark signs, Daniel owes you. Make sure you get something out of this marriage. A murmur moved through the relatives like wind through the maple tree above us. Vanessa's husband, Patrick, who'd been standing frozen by the fence since the slap, was staring at his wife like he was seeing a stranger wearing her clothes. That's out of context, Vanessa said, her voice climbing. No, Claire said, stepping forward. It's not. Every head in that backyard turned toward her. Claire came and stood beside me and took my hand, her fingers cold despite the July heat. She told me to my face that Daniel only wanted the kids because he couldn't have his own. She said it in my kitchen 6 months before the adoption even finalized, while I was pumping breast milk for a foster foster placement we were considering. She said it like it was a kindness, like she was warning me. Lily started crying, quiet at first, then not quiet at all. Owen stood rigid beside her, both small fists clenched at his sides, the same stance he took every time he was trying not to cry in front of other kids at school. I knelt down in front of them right there on the patio stone, and for the first time in my life, I genuinely did not care who was watching. Listen to me, I said, one hand on each of their shoulders. Both of you. There is nothing fake about being your dad. I didn't sign those papers because anyone made me. I signed them because I wanted the whole world, every person in this backyard, to know officially what I already knew the first time Owen fell asleep on my chest, and Lily asked me to check under her bed for monsters. You are mine. That was never up for negotiation. Owen's chin trembled. Am I the reason she hit you? Because I spilled the wine? No, I said, and I made sure he was looking right at me when I said it. You didn't do anything wrong. Adults are responsible for their own choices, not the choices kids make by accident. Lily threw her arms around my neck so hard she nearly knocked me backward. Owen followed a half second later, and for a moment I just knelt there in the grass with both of them, my cheeks still throbbing, and let the rest of the yard exist without me. When I finally stood back up, Claire was already facing her sister, and there was nothing thin or ashamed left in her voice. You slapped my husband, she said, in front of my children because you were embarrassed about a wine stain on your blouse, and you've spent 3 years trying to convince me that the man who actually stayed is the one who owes something. So now I'm the villain? Vanessa said, looking around the yard for an ally. Any ally. Margaret stood up fully this time, straighter than I'd seen her stand in years, 70 years old and steady as a fence post. You are someone, she said, who needs to leave my house. Vanessa's eyes swept the yard one more time. Patrick, motionless by the fence. Margaret, arms crossed. The aunts and uncles suddenly very interested in their paper plates. Claire's hand still locked in mine. Nobody moved to defend her. Patrick picked the car keys up off the folding table without a word and walked toward the driveway. Vanessa stood there another few seconds, furious and cornered and, I think, only just beginning to understand the size of what she'd just done, before she followed him. She had no idea those were only 2 of the messages I'd saved. She had no idea I was about to show Rebecca the rest. What happened over the following weeks unfolded quieter than the party, but it mattered more. Rebecca Stern reviewed the full message thread the following Monday, along with the loan file Sandra Kim's investigation had closed out over a year earlier, and told us plainly that while none of it constituted anything criminal on Vanessa's part, cruelty, it turns out, isn't against the law. It was worth documenting formally in case custody or family matters ever became contested again, given how openly Vanessa had encouraged Claire to treat the adoption as a financial transaction rather than a family bond. Judges notice patterns, Rebecca said. You may never need this file, but you'll be glad it exists if you do. Dr. Laura Voss, when Claire called her 2 days after the party, mostly just to talk it through, offered something simpler and more useful for the kids specifically. A few extra sessions, not because Lily and Owen were in crisis, but because kids remember the shape of a bad moment even when they forget the details, and it's easier to reshape that memory early than to untangle it years later. Owen, in one of those sessions, told Dr. Voss that he liked knowing the truth got said out loud in front of everybody, which Dr. Voss said was, in her professional opinion, exactly the kind of closure that actually sticks. She explained it to us afterward in terms that stayed with me for months. Kids don't need adults to fix every unfair thing that happens to them, but they do need to see at least once an adult refuse to let an unfair thing go unanswered. That's the moment they file away, she said, not the slap, the response to it. Margaret didn't speak to Vanessa for almost 4 months. When they finally did talk, it wasn't a reconciliation so much as a boundary-setting call, the details of which Margaret never fully shared with us, except to say that she'd told her older daughter, in no uncertain terms, that family gatherings going forward would not include comments about who was or wasn't a real parent to anyone. Claire and her mother had a harder conversation a few weeks after that, one I only heard about secondhand because Claire needed to have it without me in the room. Margaret asked her gently why she'd let Vanessa's comments go unanswered for 3 years instead of coming to her sooner. Claire told her the truth, that she'd been so relieved to have a partner who showed up without being asked that she'd been terrified of doing anything that might make me question whether the family I'd married into was worth the trouble. Margaret cried at that, Claire told me later. Not the performative kind of crying, but the quiet kind that happens when a parent realizes their child carried something alone that she never should have had to. Vanessa and Patrick separated 8 months later, for reasons that were theirs and not mine to narrate, though I noticed, without saying anything, that Patrick started showing up to Owen's baseball games alone that spring, sitting quietly in the bleachers a few rows back, clapping for a kid who wasn't his nephew by blood any more than Owen was mine. He never explained why he kept coming, and I never asked. Some people apologize with words. Others just show up on a Tuesday evening in the rain with a folding chair, and you let that be enough. We still see Vanessa occasionally at Margaret's, at holidays too large to avoid entirely. She's careful now. Not warm, not exactly sorry in any way she said out loud, but careful. The kind of careful that comes from knowing there's a folder somewhere with your own handwriting in it, and that the people who love you finally noticed. It's been almost 2 years since that birthday party. Lily is 10 now, Owen is 8, and neither of them has asked about the slap in a long time, though every so so often Owen will bring it up sideways, the way kids do, usually right before bed. A few weeks ago, he asked me, out of nowhere, whether a person has to share your blood to be your real family. No, I told him, the same answer I'd give 100 times over if he asked it every night for the rest of his life. You just have to show up, over and over, on the days nobody's watching, until showing up is just who you are. He seemed satisfied with that. He usually is, once he hears the truth said plainly enough to trust it. Lily doesn't bring up that birthday party much anymore either, though she kept, without telling either of us, a folded napkin from that afternoon with a doodle she'd drawn on it while the adults argued. A stick figure family standing under a stick figure maple tree. 4 figures holding hands, no gaps in the row. I found it a year later, tucked into a drawer while looking for tape, and I didn't say anything to her about it. Some things a kid decides on their own don't need a parent's commentary attached. My cheek healed within a week. What didn't need healing was the one thing Vanessa never understood. Standing in that backyard with wine on her blouse and 20 years of assumptions about to come apart in front of her. That the loudest proof of fatherhood was never going to come from a piece of paper filed at a courthouse. It came from every ordinary morning nobody else stayed up late enough to see.